Mr. Corzine, is there a shortfall in the customer funds that MF Global was legally required to keep segregated?
Mr. Chairman, I know only what I read, and it certainly was true on the late evening of the 30th of October that there were unreconciled accounts.
To the best of your knowledge, based on your time at the company before you left, why is there a shortfall?
Well, there are, Mr. Chairman, many transactions that occurred in those last chaotic days, and I am not aware of all those, nor do I have the information to be able to look at those transactions. And as a consequence, it would be very hard for me to speculate why or where that shortfall took place.
Let me ask in a very precise fashion. In your role at FM Global, did you authorize a transfer of customer funds from these segregated accounts?
I never intended to break any rules, whether it dealt with the segregation rules or any of the other rules that are applicable.
Are you aware of any transfers, authorized or unauthorized, of funds out of customer accounts?
I'm not in a position, given the number of transactions, to know anything specifically about the movement of any specific funds. And I will repeat, I certainly would never intend to direct or have segregated funds moved.
At what point were you made aware that customer funds were missing?
As I said in my statement, Mr. Chairman, the first that I heard of the many millions, hundreds of millions missing was on Sunday night.
I'd like to discuss how a company that's been around for 230 years fails, to the surprise of its customers and investors, and based upon press reports and your testimony, under your direction. FM Global's sovereign debt position increased steadily. In fact, it's been reported that MF Global's exposure went from $1.5 billion at the end of 2010 to $6.3 billion at the time of the bankruptcy. So let me ask this, Governor. Who's Michael Roseman?
Michael Roseman was the chief risk officer of the firm preceding my joining the firm, and was up until the end of 2010.
Explain to me what a chief risk officer does.
Chief risk officer represents the board of directors in administrating the delegation of authorities that the board assigns to the activities of the firm. They look at market risk, credit risk, operational risk. He consults with the board and consults with management.
Is it true that Mr. Roseman on multiple occasions, both directly to you and to the board, expressed concerns that MF Global was overexposed in European sovereign debt and that the firm did not have enough capital to withstand potential losses those positions might impose upon the firm?
Mr. Roseman certainly had a different view about the sovereign default risk associated with Euro sovereigns, and particularly in the context that we did other business in those countries, and he expressed that to me directly. He expressed that to the board.
Did any members of the MF Global board express concerns to you with the level of risk accumulating in the firm's portfolio?
There were multiple discussions, as I've said in my testimony, most of which I think, once I have access at records, will be documented in the minutes of the board meetings about this subject. And there were people who dissented in the debates and then sometimes supported actions that we were taking after those debates. Sometimes there were people who did dissent. I don't know the exact elements, but generally we arrived at a consensus.
Is it true, Mr. Corzine, that you threatened to leave the firm as CEO if the board did not trust your judgment?
Mr. Chairman, I did not threaten the board that I would leave. I had one specific conversation with the lead director, which could have been interpreted that way in the sense that I said if the board, using the powers that it held, had lost confidence in me, I'd be willing to step down.
Mr. Corzine, I understand that Mr. Roseman was no longer Chief Risk Officer after March of this year. Were you involved in that decision?
My view was that we needed someone in the Chief Risk Officer position that was more fully attuned to the broker-dealer side of our business than what Mr. Roseman's background was about. And there were other issues about how people worked with each other, not with me in particular, but within the firm, that led the board and my agreement to that we should change chief risk officers.
We've all been watching the Eurozone crisis unfold, and there's been significant uncertainty about its resolution. Yet you pushed forward with aggressive bets despite warnings from employees and even the board, it seems. What do you know, Mr. Corzine, that we didn't? Why were you so confident about those bets to the degree that you were willing to bet the survival of the firm and, yes, its employees, on which you were responsible for?
Mr. Chairman, looked at many indicia. First of all, the ratings, but they were certainly not the only consideration. You looked at what counterparties would charge for initial margin. You would look at how individual securities were looked at by regulatory authorities around the globe, what they were able to be used as collateral for. You would look at prices in markets to determine whether people thought the default or restructuring risk was being priced into it. So there were many different considerations, along with the ongoing dialogue, which after the fact clearly can be second guessed, that the European community was going to take much more forceful steps to avoid bankruptcy or insolvency, rather, in sovereigns' cases, and hold to full payment of the securities.
In the days leading up to bankruptcy, how often did you talk with Gary Gensler?
Mr. Gensler, no private conversations in my recollection were held between Mr. Gensler and myself. To the best of my recollection, and this is one of the reasons I need records to be able to verify, Mr. Gensler was on the general discussion with regulators on the very early hours of October 31st, and if I am not mistaken, a posting that was given to regulators on Saturday, which I guess would have been the 29th, where there were a series of regulators.
At any point, did Mr. Gensler encourage a bankruptcy filing?
In my recollection, there was no encouragement in any of those forums, and I don't recall anyone suggesting that he was encouraging bankruptcy filings.
Mr. Corzine, as a registered futures commission merchant, MF Global was subject to periodic audits both by regulators and accounting firms. What generally were the results of those audits over the past year?
Mr. Chairman, from my
As Chief
recollection.
Executive Officer, you would have reviewed those, correct?
Some of them I would, particularly if there were exceptions to challenges. As I included in my statement, we certainly had discussions with FINRA in the August timeframe that I was very much aware of. Further discussions with the SEC. There were inquiries from the SEC treatment of different points in the year, but no reporting of significant challenges to how the firm was operating that I can recall, except with respect to the FINRA issue.
But when directions and suggestions were made, as is the nature of many auditing reports, did you make those changes?
To my recollection of the details, and there are many, many elements of internal, outside consultants, and regulators, observation. We had people who made sure that we were responding. We went through audit committee reviews of those kinds of actions that were taken in response to questions, and so I had reason to believe that we did.
So Mr. Corzine, how would you respond to charges that MFG's books were a mess? And you were a supporter of Sarbanes-Oxley too, I believe, just
Yes.
like myself.
Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that our books and records were reflecting the chaos that occurred in the last 2 or 3 days as the firm was under I think I have reason to believe, based on at least the reporting that occurred in our audit committees over a period of time, that our books and records weren't in a mess. But that is a question I think others will have to think about after they look at those in retrospect. It's clear that in the last hours, the last days, there were many, 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 many more transactions than typically occur.
Question. Why did MF Global report to FINRA in late September 2010 that it didn't have any position in foreign sovereign debt when it began entering into transactions that carried European debt exposure in mid-September 2010?
Mr. Chairman, I believe, again, without checking records and without the ability to be certain on this, is it's always open to confirming with records. I think you must be reporting to looking to the month-end reports that we file with FINRA on our capital position. And in September of 2010, it is quite possible, and again, I don't have records to confirm this with, but it's quite possible that subsidiaries not in the FINRA regulated subsidiary.
My time has expired. The chair appreciates the indulgence of the ranking member and the members and turns to the ranking member if he would like to begin his